You don't belong in that seat and you know it." The words landed before anyone in courtroom 4 had time to process them, before the woman in the front row had moved a single muscle. Before Officer Brett Dalton had even confirmed that she had done anything wrong at all, which she hadn't, which he would never think to check. Because checking was not what this moment was about for him, and everyone in that room understood that on some level, even if none of them said it out loud. It was 8:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in Hargrove City, and the courthouse on Meridian Avenue had the particular tired feeling that public buildings accumulate over decades of hosting the worst days of people's lives. The kind of weariness soaked into the walls and the floors and the long fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead like something that had almost given up but not quite, casting everything below in a pale flat glow that made faces look like they were being processed rather than seen. The benches were the original wood scarred from years of nervous hands and shifting weight, and the air carried the layered smell of burnt coffee from the clerk's station, old paper from the filing shelves behind the bench, and something else underneath it all. Something harder to name, the accumulated breath of people who had sat in these seats hoping for something and mostly not received it. Courtroom 4 was not the largest room in the building, and it was not the most prestigious, handling what the docket listed as minor criminal matters, and what the people who appeared before it experienced as the full weight of the state, deciding what happened to their children and their futures. And on this particular Tuesday morning, it was about half full, a scattering of people across the gallery benches, a few law students with notebooks, a heavy-set court reporter at her machine near the bench, 2 attorneys sorting through papers at the counsel tables, and the teenager in the defendant's chair whose name was Darnell Porter, 17 years old, sitting with his shoulders drawn in and his hands folded on the table in front of him. The way his mother had specifically asked him to sit because she had read somewhere that it helped. Brett Dalton stood near the entrance on the left side of the room with his arms folded across his chest and his feet planted at shoulder width, which was the stance he had used for 22 years when he wanted a room to understand without being told that someone was in charge here. And the room had always understood, and he had come to rely on that understanding the way some people rely on oxygen, invisibly, completely, without ever examining what would happen if it stopped. He was scanning the gallery the way a man scans a room he considers his property, moving his gaze methodically from one end to the other, categorizing and filing. And when his eyes reached the front row, they stopped. She was a black woman, somewhere in her early 50s, and she sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap and her back straight and her eyes fixed on the empty judge's bench ahead of her, wearing a cream blouse and dark slacks, and there was nothing about her clothing or her posture that was unusual or out of order, except that she sat the way people sit when they know they belong somewhere, with a stillness that came not from resignation, but from certainty. And that was the thing that bothered Brett, before he had consciously identified anything else. The particular quality of her stillness, the way it occupied space without apology. There was no press badge, no guest lanyard, no name tag, no credentials visible, no one she appeared to have come with. In Brett's system of reading a room, these absences meant something. They meant she had no right to the confidence she was projecting, and the gap between her stillness and her credentials was the thing that moved him off the wall and started him walking. 3 rows behind the woman, an older black man in a gray cardigan named Henry Beaumont, who had retired from 30 years of teaching 8th grade history and now came to court proceedings. Sometimes the way other retired people went to the library just to sit with the world, and its machinery had glanced at the woman when she came in and felt something nudge at the edges of his memory, the way a face does when you have seen it in a different context. And he had quietly pulled out his phone and begun scrolling, looking for something he couldn't quite name yet. Near the sidewall, close to the emergency exit, a young woman named Destiny Cole had her phone held low against her thigh, not recording, just watching, because she was 19 and in her 2nd semester of community college, and she was in this courtroom for a civics class assignment that required her to observe a real proceeding and write 400 words about it. And she had a feeling, the specific animal feeling that young people sometimes have before adults register, that anything is happening, that something in this room was about to matter, in a way that 400 words would not be enough to describe. Brett crossed to where Deputy Nora Okafor was stationed near the side door, a young woman of 28 with 3 years on the force and a habit of standing very still when she was thinking hard about something, and he stopped beside her and tipped his chin toward the front row. Just once, the economical gesture of a man who believed that words were something you issued to people who needed explaining to. "Handle it quietly," he said. "Front row. She's got no credentials and she's sitting like she owns the room." Nora looked toward the front row and then back at Brett and said carefully and without accusation that she wasn't sure what the woman had done that required handling, and that as far as she could see from here, the woman was just sitting quietly watching the bench. Brett's expression didn't change, which was itself a kind of answer, and he said, "That's not the point," which was true in a way he didn't mean it to be, because the point had never been what the woman had done, and he walked away before Nora could say anything else. Nora stayed where she was, but her eyes followed Brett as he moved up the side aisle toward the front of the room, and she pressed her hand flat against her thigh, a small unconscious gesture of someone bracing for something they cannot yet name. The thing about Brett Dalton, that 22 years and 3 commendations and 4 internal complaints that had each vanished within a week of being filed, had produced, was not exactly a cruel man in the way that word is commonly used. Not a man who enjoyed suffering for its own sake, but a man who had developed such a complete and internally consistent theory of how rooms worked and who belonged in them, that he had long since stopped needing evidence to confirm what he already knew. And this theory, which he would have called professional instinct, and which others in the department had learned to call by the same name. Because calling it anything else had consequences, told him that a black woman sitting in the front row of a courtroom with no credentials, and that particular quality of stillness was a disruption in waiting, and disruptions were his domain, and managing them was what he was paid for. He had been doing this since 2002, the year he joined the force at 25, idealistic in the specific way that people are idealistic when they have been told all their lives that authority and justice are the same thing, and he had been shaped since then by a series of lessons so gradually administered that he had never experienced any single one of them as a lesson, the way you don't experience the way a river reshapes a stone, because each individual moment of water touching rock is indistinguishable from the last. The lessons had come from Captain Gerald Voss, primarily, who had been his commanding officer for the first 6 years, and had the gift of teaching things without appearing to teach them, who had explained the world to Brett, not through speeches, but through a series of small demonstrations of what happened when certain reports were filed and certain reports were not, of who called whose superior after a complaint was made, and how quickly certain files moved from one column of the filing system to another. In Brett's memory, there was a specific image connected to all of this. Not Voss's face or his voice, but the locked filing cabinet in Voss's office, gunmetal gray with a small padlock that Voss kept on a key ring with 2 other keys, and the understanding that what was in that cabinet was protected in the same way that Brett himself had always been protected through the quiet, reliable architecture of people who looked out for each other, which was what Brett called loyalty, and which was what it actually was, as long as you never examined too closely who was being left out of that arrangement. He was almost at the front row now, his boots sounding against the tile floor in a rhythm that the rest of the gallery had begun to track. The way people track a change in weather, and the woman in the front row had not moved, had not looked up, had not adjusted her posture by a single degree in acknowledgement of his approach, which irritated him in the specific way that being ignored by someone you have decided to confront always irritates, because the entire architecture of the confrontation depends on the other person knowing it is happening. On her wrist, just barely visible where her sleeve had shifted as her hands rested in her lap, there was a thin silver bracelet, simple with a small engraved plate that caught the light, and if anyone had been looking closely enough they would have seen the 2 initials pressed into the metal EC. But no one was looking that closely. Not yet. He stopped at the end of her row and looked down at her and said it the way he said everything, like the words were already true before they left his mouth, with the particular weight of a man who had not been contradicted in so long that he had confused the absence of contradiction with the presence of correctness. Anne Caldwell did not move immediately, and when she did, it was only to raise her eyes from the judge's bench to his face. Slowly, the way you raise your eyes to something you have already assessed and found smaller than expected. And the look she gave him was level, and without fear, and without anger, and without the small, appeasing adjustment of expression that Brett had learned over 22 years to expect from people he had decided to address this way, and the absence of it was disorienting in a way he would not have been able to articulate. She had seen this before, not this specific man, not this specific room, but the architecture of this moment, the approach, the tone, the assumption layered beneath every word. Like bedrock, and her stillness was not passivity or submission, or even patience. In the ordinary sense, it was precision, the precision of a woman who understood exactly what was happening and had made a choice long before this morning and long before this room about how she would meet it. Brett said it again louder, and the gallery began to react the way a room reacts when the temperature changes, not all at once, but in a spreading wave. A woman 2 rows back gripping her daughter's arm without thinking. A law student near the aisle snapping her notebook shut. A court reporter lifting her fingers from her keys, and the particular silence that falls when people who have been pretending not to watch can no longer maintain the pretense. Nora Okafor moved 1 step forward from her position by the side door, her voice quiet but clear. "Brett, hold on." He turned and looked at her, and she stopped. Not because she had nothing more to say, but because she recognized the look, had seen it directed at other people enough times to understand what it meant, and she did not complete the sentence, and that silence would stay with her for a long time afterward. Henry Beaumont in row 4 had found what he was looking for on his phone, and he was sitting very still now with his phone held in both hands and his mouth slightly open, looking from the screen to the woman in the front row and back again. And the expression on his face was the expression of a man watching something he had hoped would not happen. Destiny Cole raised her phone. Her thumb pressed record. Brett reached out and took Anne's arm with the grip of a man who had performed this motion hundreds of times and had never once been required to justify it afterward. The grip of someone who had learned through decades of unchallenged practice that the grab itself was the argument, that the physical fact of being moved was supposed to be the end of the discussion, and Anne's body lurched forward with the force of it, her heels scraping the tile floor with a slow and terrible sound, and then the gallery erupted, not in a roar but in something more complicated. Gasps and a sharp scream from somewhere near the middle of the room. A phone clattering from someone's hand and hitting the floor with a crack that rang through the space like a small explosion. And someone somewhere saying in a voice stretched thin with disbelief, "What is he doing?" Anne did not resist. She did not pull back, did not cry out, did not turn her face away or close her eyes, or do any of the things that fear produces in the body, because what she felt was not fear, and her eyes stayed on Brett's face, with the particular quality of someone watching a machine execute a process. It has been running so long it no longer remembers why, and there was nothing in her gaze that gave him what he needed from this moment. No confirmation that he was larger than her. No evidence that the grab had landed the way it was supposed to land. The judge's gavel came down 3 times in rapid succession, each blow cutting through the noise of the gallery like something physical, and Judge William Hart's voice followed immediately, hard and flat, and carrying the specific authority of a man who had spent 30 years in these rooms and knew exactly what he had just witnessed. "Stop. Right now. Let her go." Brett held on for 2 more seconds after the gavel, which was 2 seconds longer than he should have, and in those 2 seconds the room watched him with a collective held breath that was not about whether he would comply, but about what it meant that he was calculating whether to comply at all, that the instruction of a sitting judge required calculation. And then he released her arm and stepped back with the expression of a man who has decided to choose a different battle, rather than a man who understands he has done something wrong. Anne straightened one smooth and unhurried motion, and she did not look around the room, did not seek confirmation or comfort. In the faces of the gallery, did not smooth her blouse in the nervous way of someone reclaiming themselves after a violation. She simply stood and looked at the judge, and her stillness in this moment was different from her stillness before it was the stillness of something resolved. Henry Beaumont stood up from his row, and the movement was so deliberate that everyone around him noticed it. This older man in his gray cardigan rising from his seat, not with the urgency of outrage, but with the particular gravity of a man who has confirmed something he suspected and understands, now that he has an obligation, and his voice when he spoke was not loud, but it was completely steady. The voice of someone who had spent 30 years teaching children that facts matter, and that saying them out loud matters even when it is uncomfortable. Your Honor, Henry said I believe that is Dr. Ann Caldwell. I saw her photograph on the news last night. She was sworn in as the new chief of police. The room did not gasp. It went quiet in a way that was deeper than a gasp, the way sound disappears not from absence but from a sudden overwhelming presence. And in that quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the soft hiss of the court reporter's machine coming to a halt, and the sound of Brett Dalton's breathing, which had changed. Judge Hart reached for the folder on his bench, the one his clerk had placed there that morning along with the day's proceedings, and he opened it to the second tab where the announcement document was filed, the mayoral statement from the previous evening, and he looked at the photograph printed on the first page, and then he looked at the woman standing in the front row, and his face made the small, controlled adjustment of a man who has understood something. He wishes he had understood 30 seconds earlier, and who is now deciding how to proceed with the understanding that what has already happened cannot be unpreceded. He looked at Brett, and his voice when he spoke was not the voice he had used to issue the order to stop. It was quieter than that, and quieter is sometimes worse, because it means whoever is speaking no longer needs volume to make themselves clear. Officer Dalton, the judge, said you have just used physical force on the highest-ranking official in the Hargrove City Police Department. The words moved through the room one at a time, and each one landed separately, and Brett stood in the aisle with his hand at his side, the hand that had grabbed her fingers open and useless-looking, and his face moved through expressions that came and went too fast to track confusion, dismissal, doubt, the specific blankness of a man trying to find a framework for something that does not fit into any framework he has, and then something else, something that settled into his face and stayed, something that 22 years of commendations and protected files and a locked cabinet in a superior's office had not prepared him to carry. Anne turned and looked at Brett. Then, just once, a look that was not triumph and was not anger and was not forgiveness. It was something that required none of those things. A clear-eyed, final, unrepeatable look that said, I see exactly what you are, and I have seen it before, and I know precisely what comes next. And then she looked away from him and toward the gallery, and her eyes found Darnell Porter in the defendant's chair. Darnell was 17 and had been arrested 3 weeks earlier for standing at a bus stop and asking why he was being detained, and he had spent the last 3 weeks trying to make himself small in every room he entered. The way people learn to make themselves small, when the world has made clear that their presence is considered a problem. And he had been doing it this morning, too. Shoulders drawn in, chin down, hands folded on the table the way his mother asked, and he was looking at Anne with an expression that was not yet hope. It was something more careful than hope. It was the first loosening of something that had been held very tight. Anne said one thing before she walked toward the door, her voice level and carrying without effort through the silence of the room. I saw everything that happened in here this morning, all of it. She did not look at Brett again. She walked toward the exit with the same unhurried pace she had arrived with, and when the door opened, the light from the hallway fell across her back, and she walked into it, and the door closed behind her with a soft, quiet click that was somehow louder than anything else that had happened in that room that morning. Destiny Cole's phone was still recording. The timestamp read 9:04 a.m. Brett's hand was still at his side, fingers still open, and no one in the room was looking at anything except the door through which Anne Caldwell had just walked. Henry Beaumont sat back down slowly, placed his phone in his cardigan pocket, and folded his hands on his knees. And if you had been watching his face, you would have seen something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite grief. The expression of a man who hoped he was wrong about what he was seeing and has now confirmed he was right, and who understands that being right about something like this is not a thing you take any pleasure in. The corridor outside courtroom 4 was empty at 9:06 in the morning, except for a water fountain that dripped every 45 seconds, and a bulletin board covered in outdated notices, and Ann Caldwell stood in it for 30 seconds without moving. Not because she needed to collect herself, she was already collected, but because 30 seconds of stillness was something she had learned to give herself after a difficult moment. Not as recovery, but as acknowledgement, a small deliberate space between what just happened and what comes next. She was not thinking about Brett Dalton. She was thinking about Darnell Porter, the 17-year-old in the defendant's chair, the one who had spent the last 3 weeks trying to disappear inside his own posture, whose case file she had read at midnight in her empty new office with a cup of coffee that went cold at her elbow. Because she had told herself when she took this job that she would not become the kind of person who knew about injustice through reports and statistics without knowing it, through faces. And Darnell Porter's face was in her mind. Clearly the particular expression of a young person who has learned too early that no one is coming. His charge was trespassing and resisting arrest, and the documentation supporting it was so thin she had actually held it up to the light to see if she was missing pages. A single officer's report from Brett Dalton describing suspicious loitering near the intersection of Reed and Vine at 9:47 on a Tuesday night, and when Darnell had asked why he was being stopped, the report characterized his question as aggressive non-cooperation, and the arrest had followed from that characterization with the clean, unquestioned momentum of a machine that had been running this particular process for a very long time and had never once been asked to explain itself. Ann had been doing this for 3 weeks since her appointment was announced, coming to different courtrooms in the city on different mornings before her official first day, sitting quietly in the gallery watching, trying to understand what the courthouse felt like when you were Darnell Porter, and you had no particular reason to believe the room was on your side. And she had sat in 5 different courtrooms in 3 weeks, and she had seen this morning coming, not this specific incident with this specific officer, but the shape of it, the logic of it, the particular combination of power and invisibility that produces a man who will grab a woman's arm in front of a judge without pausing to consider whether he should. She touched the bracelet on her wrist, her thumb moving over the small engraved plate, and it was a habit so old she was no longer entirely conscious of doing it. Developed when she was 9 years old and had nothing left of her father except his name in 2 letters pressed into a thin strip of silver that her mother had given her on her 10th birthday because there was nothing else to give. Edmund Caldwell. The initials felt the same as they always had under her thumb, worn smooth at the edges from 30 years of being touched exactly this way. And she stood in the empty corridor and breathed once deliberately. And then she took out her phone and called her assistant and told her to clear the morning's schedule, that she would be at the office by 11, and then she put the phone away and walked toward the exit. Her steps even and unhurried, carrying everything she always carried, which was everything, which was enough. What she carried had a specific weight and a specific texture, and it had started on a Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1993, when the whole city smelled of cut grass and hot pavement, and her father was ironing his white shirt in the kitchen of their apartment on the south side of Hargrove. The window open, a radio playing something low and instrumental, and Ann was sitting on the counter eating dry cereal from the box and watching him the way children watch parents engaged in the ritual tasks that make the world feel stable. Edmund Caldwell ironed his shirt every Sunday morning with a seriousness that young Ann found funny and touching in equal measure, the way he set the iron's temperature and tested it on the sleeve. First, the way he hummed without knowing he was humming. The way the smell of starch mixed with the warm iron smell and the open window smell, and became the specific smell that meant Sunday morning and safety, and her father still in the room. He was 38 years old that summer, and he worked as a security guard at the Hargrove Public Library Monday through Friday. and he did not carry a gun, and he had never been in a fight in his adult life, and he believed genuinely and without irony in the decency of people as a baseline condition of the world, which was a belief he held, not because his life had been easy, but because he had decided at some point Anne was too young to remember that the alternative was worse, and he had organized himself around that decision every day since. They walked to the corner store that afternoon, Anne and Edmund, because she had negotiated an extra popsicle as the price of her company, and he had accepted the terms with mock gravity, shaking her hand on it with his big hand warm around her small one, and they walked the 3 blocks to the store at Reed and Vine, with her hand in his grip gentle and steady, and he said the thing he always said when they crossed a street, voice low and easy like a song lyric. Always look both ways before you step, and she had said it back to him in the slightly sing-song way she always did, and he had squeezed her hand once, and that was the last normal thing that happened. The shot came from behind them from the direction of the alley mouth across the street, or from a parked car, or from somewhere else. She could never afterward be certain of the direction, because sound does something strange in moments of violence. It loses its geometry. It becomes a fact of the body, rather than the air. And what she remembered was not a bang, but a pressure, a sudden rearrangement of the world's assumptions, and then her father's hand leaving hers, not pulled away, just gone, the grip dissolving the way a grip dissolves in sleep. The officer who fired was young, maybe 23, and he kept repeating afterward, voice high and shaking, "I thought he was reaching for something. I thought he was reaching for something," and Edmund had been reaching for his wallet, which the store clerk later confirmed, which was in the report that was filed, and then in the secondary report that corrected several details of the first, and then in the final report that used the phrase "acted under reasonable threat perception" and closed the case in 11 days. The camera at the corner store had malfunctioned the day before the shooting, which was documented in a maintenance log dated August 14th, and the shooting occurred on August 15th. And when Anne's mother's attorney pointed this out in the hearing 3 weeks later, the presiding officer noted it and moved on, and the case was closed, and the officer was given administrative leave and then reassigned, and the man who signed the final internal report was a captain named Gerald Voss, whose name Anne did not know at 9 years old and would not know for 30 more years. Her mother took her hand in the hallway of the courthouse on the day the case was formally closed, and they walked past rows of people who did not look at them, who had found various things to study in the middle distance: the floor, their papers, the doors ahead, and her mother bent down at the bottom of the courthouse steps in the sharp fall light and held Anne's face in both hands and said the thing she said, the thing that Anne had carried since not in her memory, as a sentence, but in her body as a fact, as the organizing principle around which the next 30 years had arranged themselves. The new chief's office on the 4th floor of Hargrove City Police Department headquarters was large and clean and completely impersonal, in the way that rooms are impersonal when no one has yet decided what they mean. With bare walls the color of old paper, a metal desk that reflected the overhead light in a way that made everything on it look temporary, and tall windows looking out over the city's east side where the morning light was still thin and gray and the traffic below was just beginning to thicken. Anne had been inside it once before, briefly, the evening of her swearing-in, staying only long enough to confirm the desk drawer opened and the chair adjusted and the window latch worked, because she was not the kind of person who moved in before she had understood the room, and she had not yet understood this room, what it had been, and what it needed to become. She unlocked the office at 10:15 that morning, her assistant waiting discreetly in the hallway with a stack of messages that could wait. And Anne went in alone and closed the door behind her and stood in the middle of the empty space for a moment, looking at it the way she had looked at the corridor outside courtroom 4, giving it its 30 seconds of acknowledgement. Then she crossed to the desk and opened the right-hand drawer. Inside, wrapped in old tissue paper that had gone soft and slightly translucent with age, was a small square of folded cloth that she took out carefully, with the particular care of someone handling something that is both fragile and indestructible, and she held it for a moment without unwrapping it, her thumbs pressing lightly against the tissue, and then she placed it at the back of the drawer where it could sit without being disturbed. She did not close the drawer all the way. She pulled the new legal pad from the stack her assistant had left on the desk, and she uncapped a pen, and she sat down in the chair. For the first time, the chair adjusted to someone else's height, and she turned to the first blank page, and she wrote one sentence in her clean, careful handwriting, pressing firmly enough that the words made a slight impression in the page below, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she closed the pad and set it aside. The phone on the desk rang her assistant's voice through the line, telling her that the video from Courtroom 4 was already on 3 different social media platforms, and a local news station had called twice. Anne said she would call them back, and then she said one other thing quietly and asked her assistant to connect her to a number in Atlanta that was saved under the name Tobias Grant. And when she said the name, her voice had the particular steadiness of someone who has been waiting to make a specific call for a long time and has finally reached the moment where it is the right thing to do. The first lesson Brett Dalton received about how the department actually worked came 6 days into his tenure when he was still wearing the newness of his uniform like a second skin. And it came not as instruction, but as observation. The best kind of lesson because it required no acknowledgement and left no record. He had filed a use of force report on a stop involving a 19-year-old black man on the west side, a stop that had escalated in ways Brett was not yet sure how to categorize. And the report was honest in the way that only new officers' reports are honest, because they have not yet learned which parts of the truth require management. And Captain Voss had called him into his office the following morning and told him to sit down. Voss did not raise his voice, and he did not make threats, and he used no language that could have been quoted back to him in a complaint which was itself a skill. Brett would come to understand was the most important skill Voss possessed, the ability to teach things without appearing to teach them. And what Voss did was simply described to Brett in the tone of a man explaining a map to someone who needs to navigate unfamiliar terrain, how the report could be more accurately characterized, meaning how the language could be adjusted to reflect the kind of situation where certain actions were not just understandable but necessary, and the adjustment once made closed the matter in 48 hours. Brett rewritten the report and nothing came of it, and in that nothing, in that clean and untroubled silence was the first lesson, and there were others like it administered over years. Each one a small calibration of the same basic principle. The story in the report was the story that mattered, and the story in the report was something that could be shaped, and shaping it was not called lying, it was called experience. The second lesson came in 2017 when a family named Webb filed a formal complaint after their son Isaiah was detained without cause and shoved into a car hood, and Brett watched the complaint file enter the system, and then watched it over the course of about 6 days, quietly move from the active review column to the reviewed and resolved column without Brett ever being called in for a meeting or asked to provide a statement, and Voss's name was on the closure document, and the complaint was never mentioned again, and Brett added this lesson to the ones before it, and went on. The third lesson was the commendation in 2021. His third, and at the ceremony, Voss shook his hand with both hands the way you shake the hand of someone you are proud of, and there was a photograph taken against the department backdrop, and Brett's smile in the photograph was the smile of a man who has been told consistently for 19 years that what he is doing is correct, and the smile had become indistinguishable from belief. These 3 moments were not the whole of what Brett was. There was a man underneath the uniform who had other qualities, who had coached youth basketball for 2 years in the mid-2000s, and who called his mother every Sunday evening, and who once helped a stranger change a flat tire in a rainstorm without being asked. And that man was real. But that man had also been standing inside a particular structure for 22 years, and the structure had shaped him, the way water shapes stone, gradually, without drama, without a single moment that felt like a point of no return, and now he was the shape the structure had made him. Sandra Porter had been awake since 4:30 that Tuesday morning, which was 2 hours before her shift at Hargrove City General started. and 4 hours before her son's court hearing. And she had spent those early hours in the kitchen of their apartment on the South Side, making coffee she barely drank, and reviewing the notes she had written in a spiral notebook over the 3 weeks since Darnell's arrest. Because reviewing the notes made her feel like she was doing something, and doing something was the only way she knew to hold back the specific terror of a mother who understands that the system her son is moving through does not require her to feel okay about it. Darnell had been at a bus stop at Reed and Vine on a Tuesday night waiting for the 47 bus that would bring him home from his friend Malik's house, where they had been playing video games and eating chips and doing the things that 17-year-olds do on weekday evenings when the world has not yet decided to treat them as threats, and he had been wearing headphones and a dark blue hoodie and carrying a backpack with a broken zipper that he kept meaning to fix, and none of these things should have mattered, and they did. Brett Dalton had pulled up to the bus stop in his patrol car without lights stepped out and told Darnell to remove his headphones and identify himself and Darnell, who had been taught by his mother to be respectful and careful with police, and who had also been taught by his own nervous system over 17 years of being black in this city to be afraid, had asked why not. Loudly, not aggressively. Just the reasonable question of someone who would like to understand the situation they are in. And Brett had written in his report that this constituted aggressive non-cooperation and arrested him under resisting and obstruction. Sandra had been trying to get information from the department ever since, and the experience had the quality that so many interactions with official channels have. When you are a person, the system is not oriented toward a series of encounters with surfaces that appear to be doors and turn out to be walls. A clerk who gave her a form that led to a phone number that led to a voicemail that was never returned. A public defender who met with her for 11 minutes before the first hearing and said, with the exhausted honesty of someone who has had this conversation many times, that the case wasn't strong against Darnell, but that the system moved slowly and she should be patient. The intersection of Reed and Vine was 3 blocks from the corner store where Edmund Caldwell had been shot in the summer of 1993. And Sandra did not know this because she had not been in Hargrove City in 1993 and did not know Edmund Caldwell's name, and Darnell did not know it. And it was the kind of fact that sits in the geography of a city without anyone needing to know it, the way certain spots in a room are colder than others, and you eventually stop questioning why. Gerald Voss's house in the Elmwood suburb was a red brick colonial with a dark roof and dark shutters, and a bronze statue of a police officer at the base of the front steps engraved with the words, "Loyalty, Integrity, Justice," in a font meant to convey permanence. And in the late morning light, the house looked exactly like what it was meant to look like, which was the home of a man who had served well and retired with his record clean. The study off the main hallway had bookshelves and a mahogany desk, and in the corner, near the window, a metal filing cabinet with a small padlock. The same model of padlock Voss had used in his office at the department, because he had developed preferences over 30 years and saw no reason to change them. And when his phone rang that morning and the voice on the other end told him what had happened in courtroom 4, Voss listened without interrupting, and then said after a pause that lasted almost exactly 4 seconds, "How bad is the video?" the voice told him. Voss said nothing for another moment, and then he said, "I'll make some calls," and ended the conversation and sat for a while in his chair looking at the filing cabinet. The specific look of a man reviewing his exposures, checking the edges of things, the way you check a structure after a storm looking for new cracks before the weather returns. He did not call Brett. Brett was not the call you made in this situation, because Brett was a problem that was already visible, and visible problems required different management than invisible ones. Instead, he called a man whose name was not publicly connected to the department, a lawyer in a downtown firm who had handled 3 previous situations of this general type, and who understood without being told that what Voss needed was narrative management, the careful seeding of alternative framings in the days before a story fully hardened. On the wall of Voss's study, among the photographs from various commendation ceremonies and department events that stretched back to the early 1990s, there was one from June 1993, a group photograph from a departmental ceremony, A dozen or so officers arranged in 2 rows, and in the back row, slightly out of focus, the way people in the back of group photos often are, was a younger version of Gerald Voss, his hair darker, his face less settled into its current configuration, standing next to a young officer whose name appeared in the caption beneath the photograph, and that name was the same name on the final internal report filed on the death of Edmund Caldwell. Voss did not look at this photograph when he called the lawyer. He did not look at it when he ended the call and sat back in his chair and considered what the next several days would require. He had not looked at it directly in a very long time, the same way you stop looking at something when you have decided that looking at it serves no purpose, and it had receded into the background of the room, part of the furniture of his life present without being seen. The video was 47 seconds long, and it began slightly blurry, the way phone video begins when the person filming is adjusting their hands, and then it steadied, and what it showed in those 47 seconds was this: a black woman sitting quietly in the front row of a courtroom. Her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her eyes forward, doing nothing, being nowhere she did not have the right to be, and a uniformed police officer approaching her from the side aisle, his body carrying the particular forward lean of a man who has already decided what is going to happen and is moving to make it happen, and his voice carrying clearly through whatever ambient noise the phone's microphone was filtering the words, sharp and certain, and addressed to her as if she were a problem to be managed rather than a person to be spoken to. Then the grab, which lasted less than 2 seconds in the video, but which had the quality of something much longer, because of the way Anne's heel scraped the tile floor, that slow and terrible sound, and the gallery's reaction, the gasps and the scream, and the crack of a dropped phone, and then the gavel 3 times hard, and the judge's voice saying, "Stop, right now, let her go," and Brett holding on for 2 more seconds that the video captured with perfect clarity. And then the announcement spoken by Henry Beaumont in his steady schoolteacher's voice: "Your Honor, I believe that is Dr. Ann Caldwell," and the judge confirming it, and the title spoken clearly into Destiny Cole's phone, the newly appointed chief of police. The video ended there at 47 seconds on the image of Ann standing and the image of Brett with his hand at his side, and those 2 images side by side in those final frames contained everything the video needed to contain. Destiny Cole posted it to her social media account at 9:22 a.m., with no caption because no caption was needed. And within 20 minutes, a journalist named Raymond Osei, who covered local government and police accountability, had picked it up and reposted it with a single line. "This is what happened in Hargrove City Courtroom 4 this morning. The woman being grabbed is the new chief of police." The video spread the way things spread when they contain something that people recognize before they can articulate why not. Because it was the most dramatic thing anyone had ever seen, but because it was so ordinary in its cruelty, so thoroughly the expression of an assumption that had been operating undisturbed for a very long time, and people who watched it heard something in the sound of that heel on the tile floor that landed in a place below language. A retired officer in another city watched it and typed, "I worked with men like him my whole career, and I'm sorry I didn't do more." A black mother of 3 watched it and wrote nothing, just shared it 4 times in an hour. A veteran who had served under 3 different police chiefs watched it, and then watched it again, and then called his nephew who was considering a career in law enforcement, and they talked for 40 minutes. By noon, the video had been viewed over 200,000 times. By the time Hargrove City's mayor, a man named Gerald Ashworth, who had made Ann's appointment and was now watching his Tuesday become something he had not prepared for, sat down to watch it in his office, it had been viewed 400,000 times, and the number had a comma in it and was still climbing. The break room at the 3rd Precinct smelled of burnt coffee and the particular staleness of a room that is occupied without being inhabited, and Owen Reyes was sitting at the corner table with his lunch, which he had not opened, watching the video on his phone for the 3rd time, when the television mounted to the wall above the microwave clicked to the local noon news and Brett Dalton's face appeared on the screen above the chyron that read, "Hargrove officer caught on camera grabbing new police chief." The room had about 8 other people in it, and no one was speaking, which was not unusual for the break room during the noon hour, but which had a different quality today. The silence of people performing normalcy while actually doing something else entirely, and a few had turned their chairs so their backs were to the television, and one had left when the news came on, picking up his coffee without explanation. Owen set his phone down on the table, face up. The video paused on the last frame. He had worked alongside Brett Dalton for 6 years, which was long enough to know him the way you know a weather pattern, not its causes but its reliable outcomes. And he had spent those 6 years learning the particular skill of not seeing certain things. Because seeing certain things in this department had consequences that he had been given to understand clearly, not through threats, but through examples the way Nora Okafor had been given to understand them that morning through the mechanism of watching what happened to people who asked the wrong questions. He thought about Kevin Tate, which he thought about most days, and had been trying not to think about for 3 years. Kevin, who was 20 and had been stopped for a reason, Owen could not now reconstruct from the report he had filed, because the report he had filed was not what he had seen Kevin's face against the brick wall of the alley on Calder Street, the thin line of blood at his temple and Brett's voice. He's resisting back off and Owen backing off, and later at the desk, Brett coming over to look at Owen's supplemental report and reading it and nodding and saying good, just good, like Owen had passed a test. Owen picked up his coffee cup. It had gone cold. He wrapped both hands around it anyway, and his knuckles were white against the ceramic, and he sat like that for a long time, not moving, looking at Brett's face frozen on his phone screen, and across the room the television played the video again from the beginning. Anne was reviewing Darnell Porter's case file at her desk when her assistant knocked and opened the door and said with the carefully neutral tone of someone delivering news, "They understand will require a measured response, that the video from courtroom 4 had reached 400,000 views, and 2 council members had called, and the police union representative had left a message, and the mayor's office wanted to schedule a call at her earliest convenience." She watched the video once alone at her desk with the door closed, and when it ended she sat with it for a moment, and then she closed the laptop and said to the empty room, one sentence that completed a thought she had been developing for 30 years, and which she would not repeat out loud to anyone else. Then she opened the laptop again and picked up her phone and called Tobias Grant in Atlanta because of all the things that needed to happen in the next several days. The one that could not wait was the data, and Tobias was the best forensic database analyst she had worked with in her years at the DOJ. A quiet and meticulous man who had once told her that if a system looks too clean, someone probably scrubbed it too hard, and who had proven this thesis in 2 separate cities, and whose phone number she had kept in her personal contacts for exactly this kind of morning. She told him she needed him in Hargrove City by Thursday, that she had a department filing system and a set of case closure records she needed him to examine, and Tobias asked 2 questions, and she answered them, and he said he would be there Thursday morning. She took the mayor's call and the 2 council members' calls, and each one she listened to more than she spoke, and what she was listening for was not what they were saying, but how they were saying it. How close the urgency was to genuine concern, versus how close it was to the particular urgency of powerful people managing their exposure, and what she heard in all 3 calls was enough of both that she was neither surprised nor reassured, which was the appropriate response. Brett Dalton was at home by that point, sitting in his living room in civilian clothes, the television on, but muted, watching the scrolling chyron at the bottom of the screen, with the particular stillness of a man who has been in difficult situations before, and has always been collected from them by the same reliable machinery, and is now for the first time beginning to wonder whether the machinery is still running. He had not called Voss because calling Voss was something he had always let Voss initiate in situations like this, because that was how it worked. Voss called when there was something to manage, and if Voss wasn't calling, then either there was nothing to manage, or Voss was already managing it, and the not knowing which was happening was the first genuinely unfamiliar feeling Brett had had in 22 years, and it sat in his chest in a way he did not like and did not know how to address. She sat in her car for an hour and 40 minutes after her shift ended, which was long enough for the precinct parking lot to empty out almost completely, and for the sky to shift from the flat white of late afternoon into the beginning of evening's gray. And in that hour and 40 minutes, Nora Okafor replayed the morning. The way you replay things you cannot change, not to find an alternate ending, but because the mind insists on the examination anyway. She kept returning to the same moment. Not the grab, not the gavel, not the announcement of Anne's title, but the moment before all of it. The moment Brett had looked at her and said, "I'll handle it." And she had not followed him. And she had not followed him. Not because she thought what he was going to do was acceptable, but because she knew, with the specific knowledge of someone who has watched the machinery of this department operate for 3 years, what it meant to visibly contest Brett Dalton, and that knowledge had been enough to keep her feet in place. And her feet being in place was part of the story of what happened in courtroom 4 that morning, and she could not think her way out of that. She was not a coward by nature. She knew that about herself. She had grown up in a family that asked hard questions at dinner tables and had gone into law enforcement because she genuinely believed when she was 24 and optimistic that it was possible to do the job well, and she had spent 3 years watching that belief get complicated by the specific reality of working inside a structure where what you saw and what you wrote in a report were sometimes not the same thing, and where asking why they were different had the kind of social cost that adds up quietly until you don't ask anymore. She had saved a number in her personal phone 14 months ago, the Hargrove City Independent Oversight Office. The city's external complaint and review body saved it after a night when she had seen something she could not write into a report the way it needed to be written, saved it without calling it the way people save numbers for things they are not yet ready to do. She took out her personal phone now, the one without the department monitoring, and she looked at the number, and she did not call, not yet, but she kept looking at it with the expression of a person who has reached a door and has their hand on the knob and is standing there a moment longer, not from doubt, but from understanding that once the door opens, the room behind you is no longer the same room. She put the phone face down on the passenger seat and sat for another 5 minutes. And then she turned it face up again and left it that way and started the car. Tobias Grant arrived on Thursday morning with a messenger bag and a laptop and the quiet self-containment of someone who has spent years in rooms full of hidden things and developed a working relationship with what he found there. And he and Anne were in the records room on the second floor of headquarters by 8 o'clock, the overhead lights bright and the air carrying the particular dryness of a space that stored paper. The file Tobias surfaced first was not Darnell Porter's. It was older, filed under case number HC-2019-0447, and the subject was a 16-year-old named Isaiah Webb who had been stopped by Brett Dalton on the west side on a Thursday evening in October of 2019, and who had, according to Brett's report, attempted to flee the scene of the stop, falling against a parked car in the process, and sustaining what the medical record attached to the file described as a hairline fracture of the left wrist, and contusions consistent with impact against a vehicle surface. The attached report was signed by Brett Dalton and countersigned by Captain Voss. There were no scene photographs, no witness statements beyond Brett's own account, no dash cam footage due to what a maintenance note described as a technical malfunction, and the case had been marked closed and resolved within 4 days. The closure document carrying the notation "no further action" warranted based on available evidence. Tobias had been doing this work for 16 years, and he had learned to read the timestamp metadata of digital files, the way some people read faces looking for the small involuntary tells that indicate something has been managed, and the tell in this file was clear. Once he looked, the closure document had been written to the system at 1:52 in the morning, and Brett Dalton's shift log showed a standard end of shift at 6 p.m. that same evening, and the command-level credential used to access and finalize the file in the middle of the night was registered to an account that had not been formally deactivated when its owner transitioned to retirement status. Anne did not react with visible emotion when Tobias walked her through this. She got quieter, which was its own kind of reaction, the quietness of someone for whom the data is confirming a shape they have already perceived and have been hoping to be wrong about. She said after a long moment, "Find me every case file in the last 7 years that was closed using a command-level credential between midnight and 4 in the morning." Tobias typed for a while. He found 9. Anne drove to Sandra Porter's apartment on a Wednesday evening without calling ahead, without her assistant, without a security detail parking at the curb half a block from the building and walking the rest of the way, because she had learned a long time ago that official arrivals closed people off, that the car and the title and the procedural framing of a visit told the person being visited that what was coming was institutional, and what she wanted from Sandra Porter was not an institutional exchange. She wanted the truth, and the truth required the kind of room that institutions tended to fill before anyone could put words in it. Sandra opened the door in her hospital aide scrubs, still wearing her shift badge and her face, when she saw Anne did the particular thing that faces do when they are arranging themselves around uncertainty, not hostile, not welcoming. Just careful, the face of a woman who had been burned enough times by people arriving at her door with official business that she had developed a thorough and reasonable wariness of the entire category. Anne introduced herself by her first name and said she had been in the courtroom the morning of Darnell's hearing, and Sandra said she had seen the video, and Anne said she knew, and then she asked if she could come in, and Sandra held the door open after a pause that was brief but real. She did not make promises. She was specific about that because promises were what Sandra had been given before, and she had learned their market value, and what Anne did instead was ask her one question. Tell me what happened the night Darnell was arrested in your own words from the beginning, and take as long as you need. Sandra talked for 40 minutes, and Anne did not take notes, and did not interrupt, and did not give the small performative nods of someone pretending to listen while actually waiting for the useful parts. She simply listened, which was the thing that no one in any official capacity had done since the night it happened, and Sandra could feel the difference, and it changed the quality of what she was able to say. The detail that came out near the end almost as an afterthought, because Sandra had told the story enough times that she knew which parts mattered, and this part had not mattered to anyone she had told before. A man named Theodore Briggs had been on the corner that night, a neighbor she recognized, and he had recorded part of the incident on his phone, and he had sent her the first 18 seconds of it the next morning, and 2 days after that, he had called her voice unsteady to say that someone had come to his door asking questions about whether he had filmed anything and that he had deleted the video and was sorry that he was afraid, and she had understood his fear because she felt it too. Anne wrote down Theodore Briggs's name. It was the only thing she wrote. She did not go to Voss's house with a warrant or a badge or a plan for what she would say if he opened the door. She drove out to Elmwood on a Thursday evening after Tobias had left and parked on the opposite side of the street from the red brick Colonial and sat in the car for 10 minutes, watching the lights in the windows, a lamp burning in the front room, a bluish television glow from somewhere further back in the house, the ordinary lights of a man spending a quiet evening in the home his career had provided. She had been doing this kind of observation her whole adult life, not surveilling in the formal sense, but in the more basic sense of looking at things carefully before she decided what to do about them, and what she saw in those 10 minutes was a house that was meant to communicate solidity, continuity, the settled quality of a life well ordered, and what she felt. Looking at it was the particular coldness of recognizing something she had been trying to understand for 30 years, which was that the people who make the worst decisions don't always look like they have anything to answer for. They sometimes look like they have already answered all the questions and retired comfortably from the effort. She called Tobias on the drive back and asked him to pull the system access logs for the department's records server, filtering for the command-level credential registered to the retirement account that had been used to close out HC201904447, and the 8 other midnight cases looking specifically for any access that occurred on or around August 15, 1993. Then she went back to her office and requested from the department archives a complete set of commendation ceremony photographs from the years 1990 through 1995, and she looked through them one by one until she found the one from June of 1993. The group photograph from the departmental recognition ceremony, 2 rows of officers in dress uniform, and she read the caption carefully. The name she found in the caption was the name of the officer who fired the shot that killed her father. He was standing next to a younger Gerald Voss in the back row, slightly out of focus, and his face was the face of a man who was 24 years old and had recently been given a commendation, and it told Anne nothing about what had happened on August 15th, and it confirmed everything she needed to know about the architecture of how it had been made to disappear. She placed the photograph face down on her desk. She held it there for a moment with her palm flat against the back of it. Then she picked up the pen. Owen Reyes came to Anne's office on a Friday afternoon in civilian clothes. No appointment, carrying a manila envelope that had been handled so many times the corners were beginning to soften, and the woman at the front desk called up to Anne's assistant who came down to escort him, and he rode the elevator to the 4th floor with the specific expression of a man who has made a decision that cannot be unmade and is in the narrow corridor between making it and living with it. He was not nervous in the way that people are nervous when they might be caught doing something wrong. He was nervous in the way that people are nervous when they are about to do something irrevocable that is also unambiguously right, which is a different kind of nervous and harder to carry, because there is no alternative version of the moment where you make a different choice and feel better. He said when Anne indicated the chair across from her desk and he sat in it. I want to be clear that I'm not doing this because I think it makes me a good person. I'm doing it because I kept quiet for 6 years and I can't keep quiet anymore, and the difference between those two things is smaller than I thought. He gave her the envelope, and inside it were printed pages from his personal copies of several internal email exchanges between Brett Dalton and Gerald Voss from 2020 and 2021. Discussing in the clinical and coded language of men who understand that institutional email is evidence. A series of case closures that needed to happen quickly and cleanly. The specific phrase "quick resolution" appearing 4 times across different threads, and once a sentence from Brett to Voss that read, "I'll need the usual sign-off by Wednesday, the family's making noise." He told her about Kevin Tate fully in the detailed and unflinching way of someone who has rehearsed the account in their head many times, but has never said it out loud before, and the telling had the quality of something being extracted rather than produced, each detail coming out with the specific weight of something that has been held in one place for too long. Anne listened without expression until he finished, and then she said, "You understand what this means for you. You're in some of these documents. Owen said I was in those rooms. If I leave my name out of it, I'm still in those rooms. I'm just lying about which side of the wall I was standing on." She slid a business card across the desk, the card of the independent legal team she had already retained in Atlanta, and she said, "Call this number before you leave this building today. They'll tell you exactly what your exposure is and exactly what your options are, and whatever you decide after that conversation I'll work with." Owen took the card, and he looked at it for a moment, and he said, "For 6 years I thought that not hitting anyone meant I wasn't part of it. I thought there was a version of staying quiet where I was still the good guy. I don't think that anymore." He left the card in his hand when he walked out, and Anne watched the door close behind him and sat for a moment in the particular silence of a room where something important has just shifted, not exploded, not resolved. Just shifted the way weight shifts on a scale when the last measure is added and the balance begins its slow movement toward a new position. She made the call on a Saturday morning at her kitchen table, which was the deliberate choice of someone who wanted to do a significant thing in a mundane setting, to make it clear to herself that this was an ordinary act of ordinary courage and not a dramatic gesture, because dramatic gestures could be second-guessed, and she had already done enough second-guessing to last her the rest of her career. She gave her full statement to the Hargrove City Independent Oversight Office, which took 45 minutes and covered everything the morning in courtroom 4, what she heard Brett say before he approached Anne, the specific moment when she knew something was wrong and didn't move, and what that not moving had felt like in the years since she had watched similar moments pass without her intervention, because it had not been the first time, it had only been the most public. She also told them about the interrogation room incident from 2 years earlier. A young black woman questioned by Brett without a lawyer present, the recording of that session, which had never been entered into any evidence file, and the location of the backup recording, which she knew, because she had been the one who accidentally tagged it to the wrong archive folder and had corrected the tag before anyone noticed but had not corrected it all the way, had moved it to a folder in the backup system that was real, but that no one looked at. which she now understood she had done, because some part of her had been trying to leave a door open in a building everyone else was locking. When the call ended, she sat at her kitchen table for a while with her coffee going cold and the morning coming through the window, and she felt what she felt, which was not relief exactly, but the particular exhaustion of someone who has put down something heavy they have been carrying for a very long time. The exhaustion that comes after the effort has ended and before the rest begins. She thought about Anne Caldwell walking out of courtroom 4 through that falling light. The soft click of the door, the way the room had stayed frozen for 5 seconds. And she thought that she understood now, not completely, but more than before. What it looked like when someone carries a weight for so long it becomes invisible, becomes posture, becomes the way they move through a room, and what it looks like when they decide the weight does not make them smaller. The federal oversight hearing was held in Hargrove City's main courthouse 11 days after the video of Courtroom 4 reached 2 million views in a room larger and more formal than Courtroom 4, but not fundamentally different from it in the way that matters, which is that it was a room where the truth was supposed to be spoken and where the truth was going to be spoken today, regardless of whether everyone present wanted it to be. Brett Dalton was brought in through a side entrance without his uniform in a dark jacket and slacks that fit him in the way. Clothes fit a person when their body has been shaped by something they are no longer wearing, and the absence of the uniform was the first thing everyone noticed. Not consciously, but in the way you notice a familiar sound going missing. A thing that was always there and now was not. And without it, he looked like what he was, a man in his late 40s who had held a particular kind of power for a very long time and was now being asked to stand in a room without it and be seen. He scanned the room when he came in a habit so ingrained it was indistinguishable from breathing, and he found the faces he looked for and found none of them offering him what he needed, and he sat down. Sandra Porter was called first, and she walked to the witness stand wearing a navy blazer over her hospital aid clothes because she had come from a shift and had not had time to change, and she sat with her hands in her lap and she looked at the room with the open gaze of a woman who has nothing to manage, who has only the truth and has decided it is enough. She described the night of Darnell's arrest from the beginning, from the phone call that came at 10:15 that evening, from Darnell's voice on the phone, from the 2-hour process of finding where he was being held and getting to him, from the 11-minute meeting with the public defender, from 3 weeks of phone calls that went unreturned, and she described it in the steady voice of a woman who has told this story before to people who were not listening and has decided that today this room will be different. Isaiah Webb was 21 years old now, and he walked to the witness stand carrying his left wrist slightly differently than other people carry theirs, held a little closer to his body, the physical memory of a fracture that healed imperfectly, and he sat down and looked directly at Brett Dalton for 3 seconds before he looked at the presiding officer, and then he said one sentence that he had chosen carefully from the many things he could have said, one sentence that required nothing added to it and nothing taken away. Owen Reyes read from his prepared statement in the voice of someone who has accepted the weight of what he is doing and is not going to flinch from it. And his voice broke once on the word pretended, and he did not apologize for breaking, and he did not try to rush past it. He just let the break exist, and then continued, because the break was part of the truth too. Nora Okafor's testimony was precise and technical, and she had the dates and the case numbers and the room numbers, and she delivered them with the flat clarity of someone who has done their homework and understands that what this moment requires is accuracy, not emotion, because the emotion is already in the room, and what is needed now is the scaffold of fact to hold it up. Brett's face across all of this moved through its progressions. The reflexive smirk that appeared when Sandra began speaking, and which lasted less than 30 seconds before it became something less certain. And then the stillness that was not composure but its absence, the blankness of a man whose internal framework is failing to process what is happening around him, because the framework was built for a world in which these witnesses did not speak, in which these rooms did not gather, in which the machinery that had always managed situations like this was still running, and the machinery was not running and he had no other framework. When the presiding federal officer read the preliminary finding, Brett Dalton remanded to federal custody charges to include abuse of power, civil rights violations, evidence tampering. Brett went very still. The specific stillness that is the opposite of composure. And he did not speak and did not move for a long moment. And then the federal agents moved toward him and he let them. And that was the end of what Brett Dalton had been. Gerald Voss arrived at his federal oversight hearing 4 days after Brett's wearing his best suit and his oldest expression of composed authority, the expression of a man who has sat across from official inquiries before and understands how they work, and has never found one he couldn't navigate, and he arranged himself in the witness seat with the ease of someone who considers themselves on a fundamental level the kind of person that institutions are designed to protect. The committee chair, a federal civil rights attorney named Josephine Park, who had the quality of absolute stillness that distinguished people who had won by waiting, asked him several preliminary questions about his tenure and his retirement, and the structure of the oversight mechanisms that had been in place during his years as captain, and Voss answered them in the measured and moderately self-deprecating way of a man demonstrating his reasonableness, offering small concessions on minor points to establish the credibility of his larger defenses. Then she projected the commendation photograph from June 1993 onto the screen behind the witness stand, large enough that every face in it was clearly visible, and she read the caption aloud, specifically the name that appeared beside Voss in the back row, and she asked, "Captain Voss, did you sign the final internal review report on the shooting death of Edmund Caldwell in August of 1993? Voss did not deny it. He pivoted using the language he had developed over 30 years for exactly this kind of moment. The language of institutional complexity, of limited information, and reasonable professional judgment in difficult circumstances, and the context of the times, and the performance was technically accomplished. It would have worked in many rooms, but this was not those rooms." And Josephine Park let him finish, and then she picked up a document from the table in front of her. She read 2 lines aloud, one after the other, with a brief pause between them. The first was from the official report Voss had signed. Subject acted in a threatening manner, reaching suddenly toward his waistband. The second was from the witness statement that had never been included in the official file. The statement recovered through Tobias Grant's work in the department's backup archives. The man was reaching for his wallet. I saw it clearly. He had asked the clerk for his total and was reaching for his wallet. There was no weapon. There was never any weapon. The room heard both lines in the same breath, and the difference between them was not a matter of interpretation or context or the complexity of institutional decision-making. It was a matter of a fact that existed and a fact that had been made to not exist. And the room understood this without needing it explained. Voss's composure did not collapse. It became visible as a performance, which is worse because a man whose composure has collapsed is frightening in one way. But a man whose composure is revealed as a construction built specifically to manage moments like this one tells you something about every moment that construction was being used. Every room it was deployed and every truth it was used to contain. He did not speak again after the 2 lines were read. He sat very still, and the stillness was not dignity. It was the end of performance, and there was nothing underneath it that he was willing to show. Ann's first official act as chief was not a press conference, and it was not a policy directive, and it was not the kind of gesture designed to be photographed and distributed. It was a set of 3 framed photographs hung in the main hallway of Hargrove City Police Department headquarters at eye level. Evenly spaced with no caption and no plaque and no explanation of any kind. On the left, Darnell Porter, age 17. The morning after his arrest, taken by his mother on her phone when she picked him up, his face carrying the specific stunned exhaustion of someone who has just been processed by a machine they didn't know existed and doesn't yet understand. Eyes wide in the way that eyes are wide, when the world has done something that cannot yet be categorized. On the right, Isaiah Webb, age 16, sitting in a hospital waiting room with his left wrist in a temporary bandage, his expression something between bewilderment and a closed-down anger that had no appropriate outlet. A boy in the specific moment before he learns to carry what happened to him as weight. In the center, Edmund Caldwell, 1991. His library ID, photograph a man in his mid-30s in a white shirt with a slight smile and calm eyes. The photograph chosen because it was the most ordinary one. The most Tuesday morning one. The photograph of a man going about his life with the reasonable expectation that going about his life was a thing he would be permitted to continue doing. No caption, no plaque, no explanation. The first time a new recruit named Davis, 23 years old and 3 days into his tenure, walked past the triptych on his way to morning briefing and stopped and turned to the 6-year veteran walking beside him and asked who the people in the photographs were. And the veteran told him the story told in the measured, factual way of someone who has thought about how to tell it. And Davis was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than the hallway required for passing, and then he straightened his collar and walked to his briefing. And something about the way he walked was different from the way he had walked in. The dismissal of Darnell Porter's case was processed on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the federal hearing, a consequence of the complete collapse of its evidentiary foundation, once Brett Dalton's credibility as a reporting officer was formally compromised, and Sandra received the call at work in the middle of changing a patient's IV line, and she said, "Thank you, and I'll call back." And then she excused herself to the supply closet and stood among the shelving of gauze and saline bags and cried for 4 minutes, timed without meaning to by the clock on the wall above the door, and then she washed her face at the small sink in the corner and went back to the floor. She called Darnell from the staff break room on her lunch. He picked up on the second ring. She told him. There was a silence that lasted long enough that she said his name, and he said, "I'm here." His voice, the voice of someone sitting very still, and she waited, and after a moment she heard him exhale a long, slow breath like something slowly releasing, and he said, "Okay, just okay," and she understood everything that word contained. Darnell's room had a poster on the wall above his desk, a black astronaut in a suit outside the space station, and the poster had been up since he was 13, and nobody who had come to that room in an official capacity, not the public defender, not the arresting officer, not anyone from the department had ever known it was there, because the paperwork that moved through their hands described him only by his charge and the details that made the charge seem reasonable, and it did not describe a boy who wanted to study aerospace engineering, and it did not describe the way he did his homework at that desk under that poster every night and thought about distance and velocity and the specific mathematics of escaping gravity. Sandra called Anne that evening. Anne picked up on the third ring, and Sandra said, "My son wants to know if the woman from the courtroom is really the police chief." Anne said she was. Sandra was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He wants you to know he's going to be an engineer." Her voice was steady when she said it. The voice of a woman stating a fact, and Anne heard everything underneath the fact and said nothing in response, just held the phone and let the silence be what it was, which was enough. She was in the office until 11 that night, the building quiet around her. The city sounds coming through the tall windows in the muffled way that city sounds come through glass when you are high enough that the street feels like something happening in a different version of the same world. And she had been working through a set of case review recommendations from the Independent Oversight Panel. Careful work that required attention and produced a kind of tiredness that was different from exhaustion. It was the tiredness of a thing being built properly, each piece fitted with intention. She stopped at 10:50 and opened the right-hand desk drawer. The cloth was there where she had placed it on her first morning, still in its old tissue paper, and she unwrapped it now fully for the first time in this room. Carefully, the tissue paper coming away in sections with the practiced care of someone who has done this many times. And what was inside was a small square of white cotton fabric, roughly 5 inches on each side, stained in the center, and one corner with the brown rust color that blood becomes when it has been kept for a very long time the color of something permanent. Her mother had cut it from Edmund's shirt the night of the shooting at the hospital before anyone asked her to, because she had understood in the way that people sometimes understand things before they have language for them that what was happening would be made to disappear, and she wanted something that could not be made to disappear. and she had kept it for 30 years in a box at the back of her closet wrapped in tissue paper, and she had given it to Anne the day Anne received her acceptance to the Federal Security Academy, with one sentence, "Don't let them forget." Anne set the cloth on the desk beside the commendation photograph from June 1993. The photograph face up. Now Voss and the young officer in the back row, slightly out of focus, and she looked at both objects together for a long moment. Then she took out the legal pad and opened it to the first page, and she read the sentence she had written on her first morning in this office. "No one gets to step on this floor again and call it order." She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned to the second page and picked up the pen and wrote in the same firm handwriting, "Formal request reopening of Civil Rights Review, Edmund Caldwell, August 15th, 1993. She signed it with her full title below her name, and the signature was the same. She used for every document, careful and legible, the signature of someone who intends to be accountable for what they sign. She placed the cloth back in the drawer. She closed it most of the way, and then, as she had done on the first morning, left it open by half an inch, the small gap that was not an oversight. She drove to Oakfield Cemetery before the city woke up in the gray early hour, when the streets were empty enough that the traffic lights cycled through their colors for no one. And she parked at the small lot near the east entrance and walked the familiar path among the headstones in the morning quiet. The grass still damp under her shoes, the air carrying that particular early morning quality of coolness that will be gone in an hour and will not be missed until it is. Edmund Caldwell's grave was under a pin oak tree whose roots had begun to lift one corner of the stone slightly over the years, and Anne had arranged for it to be re-leveled last spring, and it was level now, and the stone was clean and the name was clear. She sat down in the grass beside the headstone, not on the small concrete border, but in the grass itself, the wet soaking into her slacks at the knee, and she held the photograph she had brought, the library ID photograph from 1991, Edmund in his white shirt with his small, calm smile, and she looked at it for a while. She talked to him the way she always had, not in the internal voice of remembered grief, but in the actual voice of a person having a conversation. The specific conversational tone you use with someone you know well enough to skip the framing, and what she said was not for anyone else to hear. It was the kind of talking that is not about transmission, but about presence, about the refusal to let distance become silence. She placed the photograph against the base of the headstone, leaning it so it would stay, and then she reached to her wrist and unclasped the silver bracelet, the thin band with the small engraved plate EC that she had been wearing every day since she was 10 years old, and that had been her father's presence on her wrist through every room she had entered. Every decision she had made, every moment when she needed to remember why the work was the work. She held it in her closed hand for a moment, and then she placed it in the grass at the base of the stone beside the photograph. The city was beginning to wake up around her, the sounds starting to layer themselves into the morning. A distant siren, someone's early radio from a nearby street. The crows in the oak tree above her starting up their argument with the day, and Anne stayed where she was for another few minutes, not needing to do anything, not needing to be anywhere yet. When she stood, the grass had dampened her slacks at both knees, and she looked down at this and brushed at it with her hand and then stopped brushing and left it, because it didn't matter. And she adjusted her coat and she turned and walked back toward the car, toward the city, toward the work that was not finished and would not be finished in any single tenure or any single life, but that was every day possible. She did not look back. The bracelet stayed in the grass beside the headstone, and the photograph stayed where she had placed it, and the oak tree moved in the early morning air above them, and the city woke up around them, and the day began. Brett Dalton's uniform hangs in an evidence locker on the second floor of the Hargrove City Federal Courthouse badge, removed the creases still sharp in the way that creases stay sharp after years of habit, the empty fabric holding the shape of the thing it once contained. In the back row of a community college civics class, Destiny Cole plays the 47-second video on the projector screen, and this time she shows what happened after the 47 seconds, because she has learned that most stories stop too early, and the part after the ending is where the truth finally gets room to breathe. Anne Caldwell's desk drawer is still not closed all the way, and inside it is a small square of cloth and a legal pad, and one sentence on the first page, and underneath that sentence the second one, and underneath that the third. The work continuing the way it always has. One line at a time in the quiet of a room where someone has finally decided that the truth deserves a permanent address. If this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories that remind us all what justice looks like when someone refuses to look away.